Hello, and welcome to Notes on History. I'm Paul Stoetzel. In an earlier video, I talked a little bit about John Stoetzel, the progenitor of most of the Stoetzels in western New York today. He came to the United States in 1850 with his wife and most of his children. I'm going to talk a little bit more today about that family. A great deal of research has been conducted on the family here in the United States, but until very recently, it was sort of difficult to look across the Atlantic to look at the family there. Either the relevant documents were not yet digitized, or it wasn't really clear how to go about searching them. This has changed, and many Stoetzels have now been found in what is today the Department of Bas-Rhin, what we think of as Alsace-Lorraine. However, it wasn't immediately clear how John was related to all of these other Stoetzels. That question has now been answered using a handful of documents. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about how genealogists can tie together different people from different documents using a bit of simple logic. John's marriage record contained the clues that we need to pick out the correct family from the various Stoetzels in Alsace-Lorraine, and breaking down what had been a brick wall in the family tree led to a major expansion of what we know about the family in Europe. Many documents held at the archives of the Department of Bas-Rhin in Strasbourg have been digitized, and using those documents, a prior research project verified that John's wife was Catherine Barbara Siegwald. This was determined by locating the birth records that were kept in Alsace-Lorraine, where records, very importantly, recorded the name of the mother by her maiden name and not by her married name. That prior research established that all of John's children who came to the United States were born to a mother named either Catherine Barbara Siegwald or just Barbara Siegwald, all of them in a town called Kutzenhausen. This research uncovered the birth records for John's children, but none for John and Barbara were found to indicate their parents' names. Nor have I been able to collect death records for John and Barbara here in the States. Death records very often will include the name of the deceased's parents, or at least the names that other people believe were the names of the deceased parents. But marriage records can often be just as helpful, because wherever marriage records were recorded, in no matter what language, most marriage records tend to follow a pretty standard pattern. That pattern usually includes the names of not just the bride and the groom, obviously, but also the names of their parents, as well as any witnesses to the marriage. So if birth records couldn't be found in search of the archives there, well, then the marriage record archive in Kutzenhausen would be the next obvious choice. John and Barbara's oldest child, also known as Barbara, was born in April of 1824. So it seems logical to start the search with the marriage register for 1823. And that search did not take very long. The marriage register for that year is actually pretty short. And so this record, right here, was pretty quickly located. The marriage record gives us a lot of information about the family. In fact, it was the first document I found that named George Henry Stoetzel as John's father. We know that this is the correct John and Barbara, even though their names do not appear as such. Alsatian records of the time were recorded in French or Latin, and the record keeper who entered the information here used the French versions of their names. I mentioned this a little bit in that last video. However, take note of the differences between the recorded names and the signatures at the bottom of the page. Jean becomes Johann, Jacques becomes Jacob, and Stoetzel, spelled S-T-O-E, which is the French version of the name, becomes Stoetzel with an umlaut. Johann Stoetzel, by the way, went by John Stoetzel consistently after his arrival here in the United States, but in France, he signed his name as Johannes. The same signature, by the way, can be found on the birth records of all of his children. Even though the date of the marriage is uncomfortably close to their daughter's birth date for anyone familiar with the human gestation period, we can still be sure that this happy couple is indeed the one we're looking for because of the names and ages provided, as well as the location. Also, just for good measure, George Henry Stoetzel, or rather George Heinrich Stoetzel, John's father, as recorded at the top of the marriage record, witnessed Barbara's birth the following year. John and Barbara's daughter, Barbara, he signed both documents with identical signatures. Here they are here. Okay? Now, just like John and Barbara, no birth record for George Heinrich Stoetzel has yet been found. It may be there, it may not, but point of the matter is it has not yet been found. However, there are two other Stoetzels mentioned on the marriage record. Two witnesses. They're right here. This is French for the first witness and the second witness. Jean-Georges Stoetzel, aged 43, and Jacques Stoetzel, aged 41. They signed their names, George Stoetzel with an umlaut and Jacob Stoetzel with an umlaut. Critically, the clerk who recorded the document was good enough to describe each one of them as un oncle de la peau. I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that correctly. However, a quick plug-in of a Google Translate shows that to mean an uncle of the husband. Since we can be very sure that John married a Siegwald and not another Stoetzel, stands to reason then that George Heinrich had at least two brothers, of whom there was one Jean-Georges, or Johannes George, and one Jacques, or Jacob. We now needed to find a Stoetzel family, likely in the Kutzenhausen area, with three brothers and whose names match those on this marriage record, or variants of those names. A search was conducted looking for men with these names. Prior research into the Stoetzel family had uncovered many repeated names, including at least half a dozen Jean-Georges, or Johannes Georges, and so it would be important to narrow down the search to as small an area as possible and as short a date range as possible. Since both Johann George and Jacob all signed the marriage record, it stands to reason that they gave their ages themselves at that time. While people often provided incorrect dates, wildly inaccurate dates on the order of, say, decades or more, would not seem likely.
Mr. Burns, it was naive of you to think I would mistake this town's most prominent 104-year-old man for one of my elementary school students.
Yeah, we're not going to be that far off. And so births for the brothers in the late 1770s and early 1800s, somewhere in that range there, seems about right. This still did not eliminate duplicated names, but narrowed the list down to just two Jean-Georges. Johann Georgius Stoetzel, spelled S-T-E-T-Z-E-L, was married in neighboring Schwabweiler in 1804, and the marriage record gives his father's name as Petri Stoetzel et Maria Anna Vetter. While no age was discernible for Johann George, a marriage in 1804 may very well put his birth in our date range. Another Jean-Georges Stoetzel was married in the same town 4 years later to Eve Dorothy Meyer. His parents were J. Jacques Stoetzel and Marguerite Maurer of Schwabweiler. His age is given, but it's not entirely legible. It is clear he was in his 20s. No such document was found to provide information on George Henry's brother Jacques. However, while rummaging through the list of Jean-Georges, it was found that Jean-Georges, husband of Eve Dorothy, who I mentioned just a moment ago, also had a son by that same name who married in 1833. That marriage record, just like that of his cousin John, was witnessed by his uncle Jacques, who was born around 1782. The chain of evidence, therefore, is as follows. John Stoetzel, who immigrated to the United States in 1850, was the son of George Heinrich Stoetzel. George Heinrich Stoetzel had at least two brothers, Johann George and Jacob, both probably born within a couple of years of 1780. One of the Jean-Georges in the records had a father named Jacques and a mother named Marguerite. The other had a father named Petri. The first of these Jean-Georges had a son whose uncle was also named Jacques. John had an uncle named Jacques. The evidence strongly points towards the second Jean-Georges, i.e. the son of Jacques and Marguerite Maurer, being the father of George Henry. However, what about Peter? Could he have been George Henry's father? He did, in fact, have a son named Jean-Georges, who could have been the brother of George Henry and Jacques. However, his birth record was located in the birth register for 1787. This would have made him about 17 when he married in 1804. Not a problem, but not only is this 7 years younger than the Johann George we're looking for, Petri or Petrus, could not be shown to have a son named Jacob. And it's not for a lack of looking. When creating family trees, genealogists typically don't prove relationships using just one document. Often we have to take several different facts that logically complement each other. In this case, I don't directly propose that John is the son of George Henry, who is the son of Jacob, but rather that the group of Stoetzels described in the marriage record can be shown to be the same group of Stoetzels descended from an older Jacob. Simple, right? If you like this video, be sure to like Notes on History on Facebook, or of course leave comments below, family-friendly ones of course. Of course, if you'd like some assistance with your own family research project, be sure to click on the Contact Us link at the top of this page if you're viewing this video on notesonhistory.org. And if you're seeing it on YouTube, well, follow whatever series of internet tubes you need to follow and actually go to notesonhistory.org. Thanks for watching.